She still thinks I proposed because I love her. Nathan laughed. For a split second, I smiled. I thought he was talking about me in the sweet, teasing way couples sometimes do. Then he said the next sentence. I proposed because I couldn't save my company without her. Everything inside me stopped. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stood there, outside the half-open office door, my wallet still in my hand. Rain pounded against the windows behind me, but somehow the apartment felt completely silent. Just 15 minutes earlier, I was driving to the airport. My younger sister, Sophie, lived in Chicago, and I was finally taking a long weekend to visit her. She'd been counting down the days, sending me excited messages since breakfast. Then, halfway to the airport, I reached into my handbag. No wallet. I searched again. Nothing. I immediately remembered leaving it on the kitchen counter. I sighed, turned the car around, and drove home annoyed with myself for such a simple mistake. I thought I'd be inside for less than a minute. I had no idea those 60 seconds would change the rest of my life. The apartment was unlocked. That was unusual. Nathan often forgot to lock the door whenever he worked from home. I stepped inside quietly. The wallet was exactly where I remembered leaving it, beside the fruit bowl on the kitchen counter. I picked it up without making a sound. As I turned toward the front door, I heard Nathan's voice coming from his home office. The door wasn't completely closed. Normally, I would have called his name before leaving again. Instead, I heard him laughing. She still thinks I proposed because I love her. Another man's voice came through Nathan's computer speakers. I didn't recognize him. He sounded older, professional, probably another investor. Nathan had spent the past few months chasing funding for his healthcare technology startup. Investor calls had become part of our daily routine. The man laughed quietly. Without warning, Nathan answered without the slightest hesitation. I proposed because I couldn't save my company without her. I felt every muscle in my body tighten. He was talking about me. There was no misunderstanding, no missing context, no joke. The stranger asked, "So, what's the plan after the wedding?" Nathan sounded completely relaxed. "Once we're married, her family's trust becomes available." He paused. "No one questions a husband managing family assets." My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My family had built a successful logistics company over 3 decades. People often assumed I came from endless wealth. What they didn't know was that my parents had raised me to earn everything myself. I had spent years working as a financial analyst before taking a career break after my mother's death. Nathan always said that was one of the things he admired most about me. Now, I wasn't sure he'd ever admired me at all. The man on the call went quiet. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded almost uncertain. "Do you actually love her?" For a moment, Nathan didn't answer. A tiny piece of hope appeared inside me. Maybe he would say yes. Maybe this nightmare would somehow make sense. A second later, he laughed. It was a laugh I had never heard before. Cold, careless, almost bored. "Love doesn't pay gambling debt." The words echoed in my mind. Gambling debt? I had lived with this man, planned a wedding with him, imagined growing old beside him. Yet somehow I had never heard those 2 words connected to his life. How much else didn't I know? How many late nights, how many emergency business meetings, how many unexplained expenses had all been lies? I wanted to walk into that room. I wanted to demand answers. I wanted to scream. Instead, I stood there for another few seconds, trying to remember how to breathe. What came next was the hardest part. I looked down at the engagement ring on my hand. For the first time since Nathan had slipped it onto my finger, it didn't feel like a promise. It felt like evidence. Without making a sound, I tightened my grip around my wallet. I walked back toward the front door, slowly, Carefully, I opened it just enough to slip outside, then I closed it as gently as I could. Nathan never paused his conversation. He never came looking for me. He never knew I had been there. A few minutes later, I was back in my car, sitting in the middle of the pouring rain. My phone buzzed. Nathan. One new message. Hope you made it to the airport safely. Love you. I stared at the screen. Then I locked my phone without replying. As I pulled away from the apartment, only one thought kept repeating in my mind. The man I was about to marry had absolutely no idea that I had just heard every word. I didn't sleep that night. I tried. I lay in the hotel bed in Chicago with the lights off, listening to the air conditioner humming in the background, staring at the ceiling for hours. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Nathan's voice again. I proposed because I couldn't save my company without her. Then the sentence that hurt even more: love doesn't pay gambling debt. The human mind does strange things when the truth is too painful. It searches desperately for a version of reality that hurts less. Mine did exactly that. The next morning, my younger sister, Sophie, looked at me across the breakfast table. She frowned. "You look exhausted." I forced a smile. Couldn't sleep. She asked if everything was okay. I nodded. I lied. I wasn't ready to tell anyone. Not until I knew whether the man I loved had really spent 2 years lying to me. That entire weekend became a battle between my heart and my memory. One part of me kept repeating, Nathan would never do that. The other part started replaying moments I had ignored for months. Little moments, tiny conversations, things that had once felt completely normal, now they refused to leave my mind. First, a memory came back when I was drinking coffee with Sophie. It had happened about 6 months earlier. Nathan walked into the living room holding several documents. "They're just routine papers," he had said with a smile. "I need your signature before my meeting." I reached for the first page. Before I could finish reading the opening paragraph, Nathan laughed softly. "You don't have to read every page. I already did." Then he kissed my forehead. "Don't you trust me?" At the time, I smiled. Of course I trusted him. He was my fiancé. I signed every page. Now, sitting in that coffee shop, I couldn't remember what those papers had even been. Later, another memory surfaced. We had been meeting with our wedding planner. She asked whether we wanted separate attorneys to review our prenuptial agreement. I immediately said yes. Nathan answered before I could finish my sentence. "That's unnecessary." Then he squeezed my hand beneath the table. "We're building a marriage, not preparing for a divorce." Everyone laughed, including me. Then, that night, I told him I still wanted to read everything carefully. He wrapped his arms around me, smiled, and whispered, "Don't you trust me?" I apologized. Imagine that. I apologized for wanting to understand a legal document. At the time, I thought it was romance. Now I saw it for what it really was: pressure. One incident stood out. Nathan had asked me to become a director of one of his new companies. He said it was only temporary. It'll help with investors. Again, I reached for the documents. Again, he gently slid them away before I could finish reading. I've already gone through everything. Then came those familiar words. "Don't you trust me?" Looking back, I realized something that made me sick. Nathan never forced me. He never raised his voice. He never threatened me. He simply made questioning him feel like a lack of love. Every time I wanted to understand something, he turned it into a test of my loyalty. And every single time, I chose him over my own instincts. I had mistaken blind trust for intimacy. I had confused guilt with love. The pattern was suddenly impossible to ignore. He always wanted signatures immediately. He always made reading unnecessary. He always turned doubt into guilt, over and over again. By Sunday evening, I wasn't trying to prove Nathan guilty anymore. I was trying to prove that I had imagined everything. But on the flight home, I opened our old text messages. Whenever money or company paperwork came up, Nathan always changed the subject or reminded me how much he loved me, as if love itself should have ended every difficult conversation. When the plane landed, my phone remained in my hand for several minutes. There was only one person I trusted enough to call, Olivia Reed. She had been my closest friend since college and was now a corporate fraud attorney. If anyone could separate emotion from evidence, it was Olivia. I stared at her name on my screen. If I pressed that button, nothing about my life would ever be simple again. I closed my eyes, took one slow breath, then I tapped call. Olivia didn't say a word for nearly 10 seconds. I could hear papers shuffling on the other end of the call before she finally spoke. Natalie, start from the beginning. So I did. I told her about forgetting my wallet, driving back to the apartment, and the conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. I repeated every single sentence as accurately as I could. When I finished, the line went completely silent again. Finally, Olivia sighed. I know what you're thinking. I want to call off the wedding, I said, my voice trembling. No, she replied immediately. I want you to do the exact opposite. Don't leave him. Her answer caught me completely off guard. What? Olivia, did you hear what I just told you? Then why would you tell me to stay? Because the moment Nathan realizes you know the truth, everything disappears. The emails, the financial records, the hidden accounts, the fake companies, everything disappears. And if there are other people involved, they'll disappear too. I leaned back in my chair. The anger that had been carrying me for 2 days suddenly collided with fear. Olivia continued, her voice dropping lower. Right now, Nathan believes you're in Chicago enjoying the weekend with your sister. He believes his secret is safe, and that gives you one advantage. He isn't hiding from you. Natalie, listen carefully. If he's been lying to you for this long, he's prepared for questions, but he isn't prepared for silence. So you go home, you wear the ring, you smile, and you keep planning the wedding. Don't let him suspect a single thing. The idea made me feel sick. You want me to pretend? I want you to survive. I closed my eyes. Every instinct inside me wanted to confront Nathan, to throw the engagement ring onto the table and ask him whether any part of our relationship had been real. Instead, Olivia asked me a question that changed everything. Natalie, do you want answers or do you want the truth? At first, I thought those were the same thing. They weren't. Answers could be lies, but the truth needed proof. What if I can't look at him anymore? I asked quietly. You don't have to look at him forever. You only have to do it long enough to learn who he really is. Starting today, never accuse, never guess, and only observe. The flight home felt longer than the flight to Chicago. By the time I landed, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to cancel the wedding. Not yet. I was staying because I needed to know how deep the lies went. Nathan was already waiting outside baggage claim when I walked through the doors. The moment he saw me, he smiled and wrapped his arms around me. I missed you. His voice sounded exactly the same. Warm, gentle, comforting. The exact same voice that had calmly said, "Love doesn't pay gambling debt." I had once looked forward to seeing him after every trip. This time, as his arms wrapped around my shoulders, I only wished he wouldn't touch me. I forced myself to hug him back. "How was Chicago?" he asked. "It was nice." "Did you have fun with Sophie?" "I did." Every answer came naturally. That frightened me because lying to him suddenly felt easier than telling him the truth. On the drive home, Nathan talked almost nonstop. He told me another investor meeting had gone well, joked about wedding invitations, and asked what cake flavor I wanted. It sounded like an ordinary conversation between two people about to get married.
Only one of us knew that nothing about our future was ordinary anymore. When we reached the apartment, Nathan kissed my forehead before carrying my suitcase inside. I smiled, thanked him, and even laughed at one of his jokes because I needed him to believe everything was normal. Over the next several days, I played the role of the happy fiancé perfectly. I wore my engagement ring everywhere, met with the florist, and tasted wedding cakes. Every smile felt heavier than the one before. Every I love you from him sounded rehearsed. Every time he looked away, I found myself watching him, not as the man I was planning to marry, but as a stranger I no longer recognized. Nathan thought he was living exactly the same life he had been living for months. He had no idea that everything had changed. From that moment on, I stopped being his trusting fiancé, and quietly, without telling anyone except Olivia, I started investigating the man I was supposed to marry.
The hardest part wasn't pretending to trust Nathan. The hardest part was pretending I wasn't paying attention. Before that phone call, I had never questioned anything about his company. Like everyone else, I believed the perfect version I saw online, the business magazines, the smiling photos with investors on LinkedIn, and the glowing interviews about healthcare innovation. People called him one of the city's most promising entrepreneurs. I used to feel so proud every time I saw his name. But now I wondered how much of it had been a lie. I couldn't investigate him directly. If he noticed even the smallest change in my behavior, Olivia was convinced he would start covering his tracks. So I started with public information. I dug through every news article, business database, and public record I could get my hands on. I started to dread opening each new file. Every double click of the mouse felt like opening a door to a dark room I wasn't sure I was ready to look inside, fearing what might be waiting for me in the next set of numbers. At first, nothing looked unusual. The company had raised several rounds of funding and won startup awards. But as a financial analyst, numbers have always been my language. Where others saw headlines, I saw patterns, and these patterns were starting to tell a terrifying story. The company kept announcing massive expansion, new offices, new hires, new technology, yet revenue barely moved, while expenses exploded. A closer look revealed a dangerous cycle. Every new financing announcement seemed to arrive just before another loan. One loan covered the previous loan, then another lender appeared, then another. The company wasn't growing, it was surviving by borrowing, debt on top of debt. Even the revenue numbers looked too polished. Quarter after quarter, profits landed exactly where investors expected them to be. Real businesses are rarely that perfect. Someone was making the company appear healthy, but I couldn't prove it yet. That night, I called Olivia. She listened quietly before asking, "Do you know who's signing those financial reports?" I checked. It was the current CFO, Daniel Ross. Olivia went quiet for a moment. Find the former CFO. People usually leave before the public knows why. That advice stayed with me. The next afternoon, I found a short press release from 16 months ago. The company's longtime CFO, Marcus Walker, had resigned to pursue other opportunities. No interview, no explanation. I found his profile online and hesitated for an hour before sending him a private message. I told him I was Nathan's fiancé and asked if we could speak. He replied the next morning with only 6 words, "I can't help you. Sorry." No explanation, just a flat refusal. It should have discouraged me, but instead it convinced me I was looking in the right direction. People don't run away from harmless conversations that quickly. While waiting for another chance to reach Marcus, I focused directly on Nathan. His social media was spotless, but court filings and property records told a different story. Deep in the legal records, I found a quietly settled lawsuit involving an unpaid private loan under one of his holding companies, then another loan, another company, and the exact same pattern: late payments, extensions, refinancing. Eventually, one document referenced outstanding gambling obligations included in confidential settlement negotiations. I read the sentence 3 times.
Then a fourth, gambling obligations. It wasn't an exaggeration, it was real, and the amount was far larger than I could have imagined, hundreds of thousands of dollars. I pushed my chair away from the desk, staring at the wall in the quiet room. Nathan hadn't been trying to save a successful company, he had been trying to save himself. And then a thought entered my mind that I desperately wanted to reject. If he had hidden this much from me, if he had built this entire plan around my family's money, could I really believe I was the first person he had ever manipulated? For the first time, I stopped asking myself what Nathan was hiding. I started asking a different question. How many people had come before me?
After discovering Nathan's gambling debt, I stopped asking one question: why would he do this to me? Instead, I started asking a different one: had he done this before? The answer scared me enough that I almost didn't look for it. Part of me still wanted to believe I was the exception, that somehow our relationship had been different, or that desperation had suddenly changed him. But if I had learned anything over the past week, it was this: hope is not evidence. So I followed the evidence. I stopped looking at Nathan's company and financial reports. Instead, I started looking at his life before I met him. I searched old newspaper archives, local business magazines, and public court records, anything that still existed online. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then I noticed something strange. About 5 years earlier, Nathan had announced an engagement, not to me, to another woman. There were photographs of a smiling couple and articles describing them as the city's newest power couple. Then, nothing. No wedding photos, no marriage license, no explanation. The engagement had simply disappeared. I kept digging. 3 months before their wedding date, the woman had quietly sold one of her investment properties. A few weeks later, she filed a civil lawsuit against a company connected to Nathan. The lawsuit didn't last long. It was dismissed before trial, with a confidentiality agreement filed as part of the settlement. She had disappeared from his life, silenced by an NDA. One broken engagement could be bad luck, so I kept looking. 3 years before I met Nathan, there was another target. This second woman came from a family that owned prime commercial real estate. She didn't sue him. Instead, her tragedy was written in the debt records. Several months into their engagement, she was persuaded to sign as a personal guarantor on an enormous business loan for Nathan's startup. When the relationship abruptly ended, the company defaulted, leaving her to spend years fighting a crushing debt alone, while Nathan's name was legally shielded behind shell corporations. Then I found the third woman. Her story didn't need lawsuits or bank defaults to show the damage. She came from a wealthy manufacturing family, and just weeks before their planned ceremony, the wedding was called off. No public disputes followed, only a brief business note showing she had made a massive, unreturned private investment in Nathan's startup right before they parted ways. 3 women, 3 engagements, 3 wealthy families. One was forced into silence by an NDA. One was left holding millions in defaulted business debt. One lost her inheritance to a fake investment. Different faces, different years, but exactly the same blueprint. Suddenly, my own relationship no longer felt unique. It felt predictable. I wasn't standing in the middle of an unexpected tragedy. I was standing inside a well-oiled machine. Nathan hadn't created this plan for me. He had perfected it long before I ever walked into his life. This wasn't a man who made a mistake. This was who he had always been. I slowly opened the Notes app on my phone. For the first time, I wrote down the names of all 4 women. The first, the second, the third, then mine. I stared at the list for several seconds before typing 2 more words underneath it. Victim number 4. The moment I finished typing, I stopped seeing this as a broken engagement. This wasn't just my story anymore. It was a pattern, and if I walked away without exposing it, someone else would eventually become number 5. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, I stopped investigating Nathan. Not because I had run out of questions, but because I had started forgetting someone even more important, myself. For weeks, every waking hour had been consumed by evidence, financial reports, court records, old interviews, former fiancés, hidden loans, and gambling debt. Every new discovery pulled me deeper into Nathan's world, and I realized something frightening. Even after learning the truth, my life was still revolving around him. So, one Saturday morning, I drove somewhere I hadn't been in months, my father's house. It was the same house where I had grown up, with the same front porch where my mother used to drink coffee every morning, and the same maple tree she insisted on decorating every Christmas. Dad opened the front door before I even knocked. He smiled, but his expression changed the moment he looked into my face. "You look tired." "I am." He didn't ask questions, he simply hugged me. Sometimes parents know when silence is more comforting than advice. We spent nearly an hour talking about ordinary things: his garden, Sophie's new apartment in Chicago, the family company, anything except the reason I had come. Finally, he looked at me and asked quietly, "Is this about Nathan?" I nodded. He didn't ask for details. Instead, he stood up and walked toward his home office. A few moments later, he came back carrying a worn blue folder. "I've been meaning to give this back to you." I looked at it, confused. It was my old resume, the one I had written years earlier when applying for my first financial analyst position. Inside were performance reviews, professional certificates, and awards I had completely forgotten receiving. Then Dad placed another document in front of me, a financial analysis I had prepared years before for a logistics expansion project. Every page was covered with my own handwritten notes, risk assessments, and cash flow projections. I stared at the report. "I wrote all this?" Dad smiled. "You did. You were 27. I remember your mother saying she had never seen someone explain complicated financial models so clearly." I kept turning the pages. Every line reminded me of a version of myself I hadn't thought about in years. Confident, curious, careful. A woman who questioned numbers instead of accepting easy answers. When had I stopped being her? Dad quietly reached into the folder again and handed me a framed photograph. It was on the day I graduated from college. My mother stood beside me, smiling wider than anyone else in the picture. I smiled back through tears. As I turned the frame over, I recognized my mother's handwriting on the back. She had written only one sentence: "Never make yourself smaller so someone else can feel bigger." The room became completely silent. For the first time since this nightmare began, the tears finally fell. I wasn't crying because Nathan had betrayed me or because our wedding was falling apart. I cried because I finally saw what I had been mourning. It wasn't the relationship, it was the woman I had slowly abandoned while trying to become the person Nathan wanted me to be. Little by little, without realizing it, I had stopped asking difficult questions, stopped trusting my own judgment, and stopped believing my instincts. I had made myself smaller, believing love required it. My mother had tried to warn me years before I ever met him. I just hadn't understood the lesson until now. Dad handed me a tissue, but said nothing. He didn't need to. The answer had already become clear. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life wondering whether Nathan had ever loved me. That question no longer mattered. The only question that mattered now was this: what was I going to do with the truth? I wiped away my tears, picked up the photograph, and placed it carefully back inside the folder. Then I looked at my father. "I'm ending the engagement." He nodded slowly. I figured. I took a deep breath. But that's not enough. I'm not just walking away. I won't let him do this to someone else. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't thinking like a heartbroken fiancé. I was thinking like the financial analyst I used to be. And that woman had finally come back. The moment I decided I wasn't going to let Nathan do this again, everything changed. Until then, I had been collecting information. Now I was building a case. Olivia made one thing very clear from the beginning. Forget revenge. Think like an investigator. Inside her office, she spoke like the corporate fraud attorney she had spent years becoming. Every document had to be verified, every timeline had to match, and every accusation had to be supported by hard evidence. If one piece falls apart, she warned me, Nathan will argue that everything else is a lie. So we started over, not with assumptions, but with absolute proof. Instead of sorting through endless paper trails, we built a single, unbreakable timeline. We systematically linked Nathan's desperate emails, recorded conversations from previous business disputes, and a mountain of emergency loan documents. The pattern was undeniable, one loan covering another, over and over. Then came the gambling records. The numbers made me sick. Nathan had lost enough money to destroy everything he had built, and instead of admitting it, he had decided to pay his debts with my family's wealth. A few days later, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a name I hadn't expected to see again. Marcus Walker, Nathan's former chief financial officer. I answered immediately. His voice sounded tired. "I owe you an apology. I thought ignoring you would protect my family. I don't think that's true anymore." The next afternoon, Marcus met with Olivia and me. He confessed that Nathan had become obsessed with keeping the company's image alive, repeatedly ignoring warnings about manipulating financial reports. Marcus had resigned because he refused to sign statements he knew were misleading. Before leaving, he handed Olivia the final piece of our puzzle. Internal financial reports and board communications he had kept for his own protection. Olivia organized everything into one devastating timeline: the fake financial statements, the gambling debts, and Marcus's sworn statement. Then she aligned them with official SEC filings. The public story and the private reality were completely different. The new investor financing was immediately being funneled to pay off old personal debts. The cycle was toxic, and it was only a matter of time before everything collapsed. Late that evening, Olivia closed the final folder and looked at me. "We have enough." I looked at the stack of evidence covering her conference table. Months earlier, I would have imagined exposing Nathan on social media, watching the internet destroy him. Now, none of that appealed to me. "I don't want a social media trial," I said quietly, "and I don't want newspaper headlines either." Olivia waited. "So what do you want?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I thought about Nathan, the man who cared more about appearances than anything else: the interviews, the magazine covers, the standing ovations. Then I finally smiled, not because I was happy, but because I knew exactly where the truth belonged. I want Nathan to face the truth in the place he's proudest of: the upcoming investor presentation, the one where he plans to convince the world that everything is perfect. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't reacting to Nathan's plan anymore. I was preparing my own. The morning of Nathan's investor presentation felt strangely peaceful. Not because I wasn't afraid, I was, but fear loses its power when you've already decided what you're going to do. Nathan spent the entire morning rehearsing his speech, adjusting his tie 3 different times, and practicing his fake, charismatic smile in the bathroom mirror. He walked around our apartment repeating opening lines to himself like an actor preparing for opening night. I watched quietly. He had no idea that I had rehearsed something too, just not the speech he was expecting. The event was held at one of the largest convention centers in the city, with more than 700 founders, investors, and business reporters filling the ballroom. The entire presentation was even being live-streamed to potential investors worldwide. This was the biggest day of Nathan's career. A successful funding round today meant tens of millions of dollars in new investment. At least, that was his plan. Backstage, Nathan smiled at me and patted my shoulder. "You look beautiful. Nervous?" "A little," I replied. He laughed arrogantly. "Don't be. Everyone's going to love you." If only he knew.
The lights dimmed, dramatic tech music filled the ballroom, and Nathan walked onto the stage to immediate applause. For nearly 40 minutes, he delivered a flawless presentation on artificial intelligence and healthcare innovations. The audience nodded, investors took notes, and everything looked perfect. Then Nathan smiled toward the front row. And before we finish, I'd like to introduce someone very special, the future Mrs. Cole. The arena erupted in applause as cameras turned toward me. Nathan extended his hand. I stood, smiled, and walked onto the stage exactly as he believed we had rehearsed. Nathan handed me the microphone. I told everyone you prepared a little surprise. I smiled at him, then faced the audience. Nathan's right, I did prepare something. The massive screen behind us lit up. Instead of the engagement photo Nathan expected, a single word in bold, blood-red text filled the screen. Nathan's smile instantly froze. I looked out at the audience. I thought I was here today to celebrate the happiest chapter of my life. I was wrong. With a press of the remote, the screen shifted. Photographs of 3 different women from Nathan's past appeared, lined up in chronological order alongside their wedding cancellation dates and the wealthy families they belonged to. The audience stopped smiling. A heavy, uncomfortable murmur began to ripple through the 700 people in the hall. Nathan took a sharp step toward me, his face suddenly turning pale. "Natalie," he whispered, his hand reaching aggressively for the remote. I calmly stepped back, out of his reach, and pressed the button one more time. The final slide filled the screen. 4 photographs, the first 3 women, and then mine. Underneath them were 7 simple words. Victim number 4? The ballroom fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. Not a single camera shutter clicked. Nathan stared at the screen, panic finally breaking through his polished exterior. Beads of sweat broke out on his forehead, and his breathing turned ragged. "Natalie, stop, I can explain," he stammered, his voice cracking into the microphone. "You've had years to explain," I said, turning away from him to face the crowd. "I'm not asking anyone here to believe my opinion. I'm asking you to examine the evidence." The screen quickly filled with an undeniable timeline connecting Nathan's gambling debts, his emergency business loans, and his fraudulent bank transfers, alongside Marcus Walker's signed affidavit. The audience wasn't just watching anymore. Investors were leaning forward, gasping, and typing furiously on their phones. Nathan looked as though he was going to faint. He lunged forward to grab my arm, but before he could touch me, the production booth executed my final command. An audio recording began playing loudly through the ballroom speakers. Nathan's voice boomed over the crowd, crystal clear. "She still thinks I proposed because I love her. I proposed because I couldn't save my company without her." Several high-profile investors in the front row stood up immediately, folding their arms in disgust. Nathan froze in place, his lips trembling, his hands shaking violently as his own voice delivered the final blow through the speakers. "Love doesn't pay gambling debt." The recording stopped, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Nathan's perfect image, built carefully over years, had collapsed in less than 5 minutes. I looked around the ballroom one last time, raised the microphone, and spoke clearly for the ears of everyone in the room. Love asks for trust, but fraud depends on blind trust. I lowered the microphone. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, and I didn't look back at Nathan as his knees buckled on the stage. The evidence had already said everything, and for the first time since that rainy afternoon, the truth no longer belonged only to me.
No one applauded. No one spoke. More than 700 people sat in complete silence, staring at the giant screen behind me. For the first time that afternoon, Nathan wasn't the man controlling the room. The evidence was. I held the microphone with both hands, my voice remaining steady. Not because I wasn't hurting, but because this moment was no longer about my pain. It was about the truth. I looked around the silent ballroom before speaking one final time. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm asking you to look at the evidence.
Then I stepped away from the center of the stage. I had nothing else to add. The documents, the recordings, and the financial timeline had already said everything. The heavy silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like hours before the financial guillotine began to fall. First came the money. Ethan Brooks, the managing partner of the venture capital firm leading the funding round, stood up and adjusted his suit jacket. His voice was cold, professional, and broadcasted through the wireless microphone for everyone to hear. Our firm is immediately suspending today's investment process, effective immediately. This transaction is now under formal legal review. Before Nathan could even process the blow, a representative from the commercial bank scheduled to finance his expansion stood up right beside Ethan, her voice cutting through the whispers. Based on the information disclosed, our bank is also suspending all pending loan disbursements until our compliance department completes its review. Nathan finally found his voice, his arms waving frantically. "Ethan, this isn't what it looks like. You can't make that decision based on one presentation." But no one answered him. The bank representative simply sat down, refusing to even look in his direction. Then came his own company. The chairman of Nathan's board of directors slowly rose from his seat in the front row. He spoke slowly, choosing every word to destroy what was left of Nathan's authority. "On behalf of the board, we are placing Mr. Nathan Cole on immediate administrative leave while an independent investigation is conducted." Nathan stared at him in utter disbelief, taking an unsteady step back. "You can't do that. This is my company." The chairman looked directly back at him, his voice flat. "We can, and we just did." Nathan was trembling now, his face slick with sweat. He reached desperately for the microphone, his voice cracking. "I can explain all of this. I've been under enormous pressure. The company—" "Don't," a calm, commanding voice interrupted. Everyone turned. It was Olivia Reed, my closest friend and the corporate fraud attorney who had spent weeks helping me build this trap. She stood up slowly, her face showing no satisfaction, only absolute certainty. She looked directly at Nathan's panicked eyes. "Don't explain. Not here. If you have something to say, you can say it where evidence is examined under oath." Nathan opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time since I'd known him, he had nothing left to persuade people with. No carefully rehearsed speech, no perfect smile, no perfect image. Only silence. Around the ballroom, the spell was broken. People quietly began closing their laptops, investors gathered their notes, and journalists lowered their cameras. Not because the story was over, but because they already had the only headline that mattered. I stood near the edge of the stage and watched the room empty. Surprisingly, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel relieved. I didn't even feel angry anymore. I simply felt finished. The truth had reached the people who needed to hear it, without shouting, without revenge, and without drama. Just evidence. Nathan slowly looked around the empty, cavernous ballroom. Every person he had hoped would invest in his future was gone. That was the moment I finally understood something. I hadn't taken anything away from Nathan. I hadn't ruined his career or destroyed his company. He had spent years building a massive, beautiful stage designed to convince the world he was successful. All I had done was turn on the lights. And under those lights, the person everyone finally saw was the person Nathan had chosen to become.
A year later, people still asked me about Nathan. Sometimes they recognized my name from the live stream, or they remembered the endless headlines, court investigations, and legal battles that followed. I usually gave them the same simple answer. I don't really know. Because I didn't. Not anymore. At some point, I just cut ties with the gossip, drew a line under the past, and refused to read another article. Nathan's future was now the responsibility of judges and regulators. Mine was finally my own again, and that was enough. For the first few months, I rebuilt my life without asking anyone for permission. I updated my resume to honestly reflect the professional analyst I had become. My family offered to use their deep corporate connections to find me an easy position, but I politely said no. I needed to know whether I could stand on my own 2 feet again. So I threw myself back into the job market. I faced a brutal wave of ignored applications and polite rejections from companies claiming I had been away from the financial industry for too long. Every rejection stung, but none of them made me question my worth. I had already survived something much worse. Then I walked into an interview with a major financial consulting firm. The hiring manager, Rebecca Lawson, closed my folder and asked the one question I knew was coming. Natalie, why should we hire someone who's been away from the industry? A year earlier, I might have panicked. Instead, I just smiled. Because I know exactly what happens when people stop asking difficult questions. I know how easily trust can be replaced by verification, and how dangerous it is when intelligent people become afraid to look at the numbers. Good financial decisions aren't built on confidence, they're built on evidence. The room stayed silent for several seconds. Then Rebecca smiled. That's one of the best answers I've heard in a long time. 3 days later, she called to offer me the job. I didn't cry or scream. I simply sat in my apartment and smiled. I hadn't just defeated Nathan. I had proven to myself that I never lost my ability. I had only lost my confidence, and confidence can always be rebuilt. The following year became one of the happiest of my life, built entirely on honesty. I enjoyed my work, trusted my instincts, and asked hard questions without ever apologizing. Most importantly, I stopped making myself smaller just to make someone else feel bigger. Eventually, I received an invitation to speak at a conference for young women entrepreneurs. I almost declined, but then I remembered my mother's voice. If your experience can help someone else, don't hide it. Standing behind the podium, looking across a ballroom filled with ambitious young founders, I didn't mention Nathan once. I didn't replay the betrayal or the investigation. My life was never supposed to be a story about him. Instead, I spoke to them about the courage to trust evidence over appearances and the absolute responsibility of protecting your own judgment. When I reached the end, I paused, letting the silence settle over the room before sharing one final thought. The most valuable thing I got back wasn't my career, it was my voice. The entire audience stood up, and thunderous applause filled the room. A year ago, I thought being chosen by the right man would prove my worth. Now I understood that worth isn't something another person gives you, it's something you simply refuse to surrender. I smiled, thanked them, and walked off the stage. The applause followed me all the way to the exit, but this time I didn't need it. I no longer needed any man's approval to know my own value.